Welcome to Inquiry, a podcast geared towards students where we discuss all things related to tech, from school to industry.
My name is Annie.
And I'm Daniel, and together, we are your co-hosts. For today's episode, we are so excited to introduce Amy Zhou. Amy is a senior associate in Capital One's Process Manager Development Program. Amy, who graduated from Queen's Commerce in 2019, leads the Digital Channels product roadmap for the Hudson's Bay Canada Partnership. In Human Talk, that means she manages the online banking and digital alerts product. And she spends her day championing the best possible user experience on her products. Outside of work, Amy is an adventurer by nature, and she's traveled to and studied across 20 countries across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Though these days she's staying safely at home, wondering whether her passport feels lonely. She loves to continuously grow and help others in their development journeys, so you'll often find her trying new things, most recently calligraphy, and working with her mentees and buddies. We are honored to have you with us today, Amy. Thank you so much for taking the time. Can you start us off by telling everyone a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you so much for your time. And sure, so professionally, I am a senior associate at Capital One, and I lead something called Digital Channels. It's also called Digital Platforms for our Hudson's Bay partnership. And the specific products that I manage are our online banking platform and digital alerts. In Human Talk, basically what that means is I'm the champion for both of those products within Capital One. And when we need to change something or we need to upgrade something, that all goes through me. And I work with the appropriate development and design teams to make those things happen. Right now, what we're working on that's really exciting is a big migration from an old card platform to a newer card platform. And I'm basically defining the North Star for what it's going to look like when that happens. Outside of work, as you noted, I'm really into adventures. These days, my most intrepid adventures are to IKEA, not to any of the international countries that I've been to before, but I'm hoping that will change in the new year at the very least. I'm also really into trying new things. As you noted, calligraphy is something that I've been trying these days, and I'm a huge advocate for uplifting others as they go through their development journeys. So mentorship is something that's really important to me and that I'm really passionate about.
That sounds great. Out of curiosity, which country did you enjoy the most visiting throughout the 20 plus that you've been to?
Oh, that's such a hard question. This is going to sound like a huge cop-out, but I think my favorite country was actually England. So I'm really into British history, and being in London, getting to see the Crown Jewels, getting to see the Tower of London, getting to see all of these important historical buildings, that was really exciting for me. And I was just fangirling throughout London in the Soho district and beyond.
That sounds great. So to go back a bit on your path, so you started out by pursuing a business degree at Queen's. What led you to take on that degree in specific?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the time, when I was in high school, I participated in something called DECA, which is a business case competition. And I ended up making it to the final rounds that were held in Atlanta, Georgia. I think it's called ICDC. And I remember that experience really showed me that I really wanted to pursue something in business. I really liked the experience of being in that competition. I really liked considering business issues and how I would respond to certain situations. So I really felt that business school was a good fit for me. And then it was more of a matter of applying to them and then prioritizing which ones I really wanted to attend. Queen's Commerce ended up being a really good fit because I'm very interested in schools that provide a really good school life balance, that have access to really cool extracurriculars. I was really interested in international travel, and their exchange program seemed like a really fun opportunity. And a lot of the people that I had met who had studied in Queen's Commerce were really cool. I really felt like I meshed with them. And for all of those reasons, it felt like a good fit for me.
That sounds great. So when did you first become interested in tech? And what was it that really piqued your curiosity?
That's a great question. So interesting to me because the tech industry is so new. Originally, I was really attracted to it because they tend to be very young organizations. A lot of the people that work there tend to be closer in age to me. And I found that really attractive and made it feel a lot more relatable. But I actually really like tech companies because a lot of their business models resonate with me. Tech products are often built to be highly scalable. They're built to be a little bit less manual and more automated and logic-based. The way that it's scalable, the way that it doesn't require a lot of traditional overhead, like in a brick and mortar business where you have to pay for things like renting and like special logistics management. It was a lot cleaner to me, which I found really attractive. And I think those are the two main reasons why I was really attracted to the tech industry. I liked that it was young. I liked that it felt relatable and approachable. I liked the business model of a lot of tech companies where the scalability and the cleanness of their operations.
So, with your tech interest in mind, did you try to participate in any clubs or tech activities in university?
I'll be transparent with you. I wish I did, but I didn't. I actually spent a big chunk of my time at Queen's abroad because I did 2 exchange semesters, one in 3rd year and one in 4th year. So that kind of disrupted my ability to participate in extracurricular activities. I did participate in something called the Queen's Conference on Business and Technology, where a lot of tech companies were sponsoring. Capital One was one of them. And the conversation was really about the intersection of business and technology and where innovation and good business practices could tie together in order to build a more robust tech industry. Ever since university, though, I've gone a bit more involved, and I highly suggest that others do as well. I've done a couple hackathons since I graduated from Queen's. I find them a really fun way to combine everything that goes into the end-to-end process of building something and condensing it all into one weekend. Every time I do it, I think I learn something new about something that I could do a little bit better that I've seen when we have to replicate this in hyperspeed, or I get to learn from other people who are also really passionate and excited about building things in tech. That's something that I wish that I had done more of when I was in university, but I never could find the time and I was never in the right country to.
That sounds great. I've heard a lot of good things about hackathons. So, would you say that the business conference that you attended at Queen's was the first place that you really had an interaction with tech companies in the business space?
I guess technically the first time I had really thought about it as an industry. I took part in something called Junior Achievement when I was in high school. And that was a place where you got to, I worked with a really great set of advisors. So they would take us to these cool office visits, and you got to meet a lot of interesting speakers that they would bring in. So I met people from Facebook and Google. And I think that to me was the very first time it had ever surfaced to me like, oh, this is actually really cool. This is a viable career opportunity. This is an industry I want to learn more about.
That sounds great. So, what would you say is the impact that your commerce degree has on your career right now?
That's a good question. I think that the work that I do right now, I certainly approach it from more of a business lens because of my background in business. So what that means is when I'm thinking about the things that I need to be doing, I'm thinking about the business objective that I'm trying to be accomplishing, not just literally tactically what I'm trying to do, but what's the bigger objective of what I'm trying to accomplish? Am I trying to reduce call center impacts? Am I trying to reduce regulatory risk? Am I trying to do something that'll make it easier for us to monetize something later on? I think that when I approach decisions and work that I'm doing, my thought process very much ties into the business's overall objectives. And I think that's the most fundamental way that my degree has really shifted or shaped how I operate today.
That sounds great. So, when and how did you first decide that you wanted to go and pursue product management?
That's a great question. I've never been able to pinpoint the specific time when that happened, but I think it was when I was first thinking about what I wanted to do after I graduated from Queen's. My 4 years were up. It was time to figure out what I wanted to do, what kind of trajectory I wanted to set myself on. I've always been the kind of person that liked working in teams and coordinating the delivery of something. I've always been someone who really likes to create things, to build things. I've always been someone who's really interested in the tech industry because I really respect the business models that they often have. And I really loved the youthfulness of the industry. All of that together made me feel like product management was a really good fit. A secondary and perhaps less related reason is because I am frequently that person who would be looking at a product and I'll be thinking, oh, this is so cool, but I wish you could do this. I wish you could add this feature. I wish you could add this functionality. That would make my life so much easier. As a consumer, I'm not always the decision maker or the person who is able to prioritize that work. But as a product manager or as someone who works in like a product-esque world, that is something that is within your realm of possibility.
So I myself have also found myself in a situation where I'm thinking like, oh, this thing would be so much more convenient if it had XYZ feature. And I've wondered, as a product manager, how do you decide which features or new products you want to prioritize?
That is a very relatable question and one that I feel viscerally. I think there are a couple ways that I can answer this, but the way that I usually think about it is when you're prioritizing something, it's all about what is your big priority. So if you lead some kind of product or you lead some kind of platform, you probably have some sort of big objective that you're trying to accomplish. What is your main KPI that you're trying to be addressing? Is it something like engagement? Is it something like monetization? Is it something else? Those are the big objectives you're trying to accomplish. And often you'll be looking at individual builds or changes that you can be making in relation to that big objective. The way I often think about it is it usually boils down to, if you just imagine a really big spreadsheet where the first column is your blue sky of potential features. This could come from you and things that you've learned as you talk to your users and you do user research. It could come from complaints that have been made, very vocally or otherwise. It could come from stakeholders that you have, whether they're internal to the company. People want to be changing something and they really appreciate if your platform could do X, Y, or Z. It might come from an external stakeholder, like a partner who is influential, who wants something to be built. There are lots of channels where potential features, like the ones you and I really want to get prioritized and the features that we really care about. There are lots of places where that can come from. But then when you're looking at prioritizing them, it's all about building a way to make good decisions. And good is a subjective term that can be defined however you see fit. But the way I think about it is often the first column you might be looking at is something like impact. So you might be considering how much does this specific feature or how much does the pain point that this feature addresses, how much can this specific feature that you're trying to build impact the big KPI you're trying to address? Or how much will addressing this feature alleviate a central pain point of your user? You're going to look at how it impacts it, and maybe you'll give it a score. In your next column, you might be looking at something like level of effort. Is it going to take a lot of time for you to build this? Is it going to require a lot of manpower? What is the actual level of effort here? You might give that a rating too. And then I will often look at something that I call like flags. So is this something that is legally permissible? Yes or no? If it's not, maybe you need to be rethinking your strategy here. Is this something that is a fundamental pain point? Is this something that is considered really, really MVP to this experience of what you're trying to build? If it is, you're probably going to want to be scoping that in. It kind of ends up being, often it's going to be kind of like almost a big spreadsheet where you're looking at algorithmically, hey, this is the impact that these things are going to have. This is the level of effort. These are some of the flags that are part of these features. And then you're going to look at, okay, when you're looking at all of it in context, which ones are the ones that make sense for you to prioritize now or later?
That sounds great. So what I'm wondering is, let's say there's this feature that you decide to roll out. How long does it usually take from the brainstorming to the official implementation? And how many steps would you say you have to go through to be able to start from 0 and go to 100?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's like a set time frame for how long these discussions can take. They will vary based on the complexity of the feature, based on like how many voices need to weigh in order to make that decision. Your second question was about like, what do the steps look like? That's a really good question, actually. So I think it depends on what product you're working on and how your company likes to do these ideation sessions. But some of the steps that I think about are, you're going to want to be consulting your stakeholders. That's one of the big steps here. So people who are actually going to be building this, your development team, your design team, consulting them on what these like pain points are, how you're proposing addressing them, and then moving forward from there. You're going to probably have a session where you're discussing, okay, how do we prioritize the things that we've determined we want to address? You're going to have some conversations on, okay, what does that look like? How do we whiteboard it? What do we want the customer journey to look like? How do we map it out? And then you might have some further conversations where you're looking at like, what are the stories that are going to be involved here? What are the test cases that you're going to have? What are your acceptability criteria? This whole process end to end, you also, of course, include like the actual development of the feature, testing and monitoring of the feature, test cases that are involved here. End to end, this process can take a really, really long time, or it can be a lot shorter, depending on whether your company is Agile or waterfall in their methodology, depending on how many stakeholders need to weigh in here, depending on if there's additional information you need to continue to gather before you can make your decision.
That sounds great. So you've mentioned the Agile and waterfall methodology. Could you just develop a bit more on that?
I think that it essentially boils down to how you coordinate your decisions. I think a waterfall methodology is one where you basically will have all of these decisions made in batch, and then you'll move on to the next set. And whatever you've made in the previous waterfall iteration, that's done. That's it. With Agile, you can pivot a little bit more. That means you're doing these things quickly. You're working on shorter sprints. You're pivoting more in between sprints. You're trying to be more like MVP, like, okay, what's the lowest level of effort we can put in to test something within the market? And then we can pivot accordingly. A lot of tech companies, I think, often will work on the Agile framework. My company does, where we're trying to get at information or observed behavior with the least amount of building possible so that we know how to pivot in the future. Waterfall can often be a really good method if you're doing something like a big migration, or you're doing something that is more of a big bang, where you will require more coordination in certain phases as you move from phase 1 to phase 2, phase 3, and you need more definition there, and you're not able to pivot as much.
Okay, that makes sense. That's a really good explanation. So I feel like as time goes on, the users' needs will like change and their wants will also change. So how do you as like a product manager make sure to adapt and stay on top of those changes?
That is a really good question. So as I was saying before, there's often some time that elapses between when you're initially collecting information and ideating to when you actually deploy something. It's always important to keep up to date with your users, with applicable data on engagement of other features that you have that are related, or make sure that the information you're going off of is still valid for the current situation. It's often really difficult to perfectly predict what a customer or a user is going to want in any given phase, especially as time goes on and trends change and tastes change. I think the way that I want to answer this question is to say it's important to be up to date and empathetic with who your customer or who your end user is today, not who they were 2 years ago when you were starting this, not who they were like a few months ago when you were working on this other piece that's related. Who are they today? What are the things that they've been reporting that they care about today? What are the things that they've reported that they really love, that they really don't love, that they would like you to fix? Keeping that information as up to date as possible and really finding ways to develop empathy with your user. Like something I've always wanted to do more of is user interviews, like actually talking to people that are the end users of the things that you're trying to create. Having that empathy, keeping your information up to date, and refreshing the metrics that you're using, that to me is how you can stay abreast of what your customer or end users' needs are.
That sounds great. So you mentioned user interviews. So I was wondering, when it comes to gathering information, apart from that, I know there is a lot of methods to go about it. For example, surveys or like social media and like different channels. In your opinion, what do you think is the most efficient way of gathering the users' opinions?
Efficient is an interesting adjective to use there. Like when you say efficient, it makes me think, oh yeah, the easiest, fastest way to gather information. That might be something like just big surveys that you can send out. That would be pretty efficient because you'd be able to have the information already broken down for you. You could specifically tailor how you want those questions to be broken out. But to me, the most complete way to get information about how a user feels, what they want, is by actually talking to them and understanding where they're coming from and their experience of using your product. Why are they using it? Why do they care? What are the things that they love? What are the things that they don't love? What are the things that you can do to make their lives easier? What are the things you can do to make them more delighted in using your product? It's not always very efficient, I think, to talk to an end customer. We have a program called Coffee with Customers at Capital One. It takes some time for you to schedule in one where you're actually able to sit down with them and talk. It's definitely not the most efficient way, but I see it as a way to hone your muscle in empathy, which I think is the most fundamental thing that you need to be good at if you're going to be managing a platform or a product that people, like real people, are using. So that's a long way of saying, I think to answer your specific question, which is what is the most efficient way? It's probably going to be more digital tools like user surveys or compiling data you're getting from your call centers or something like that. But I think a more comprehensive method, one that's going to be building your empathy muscle and one that's going to enable you to be better at understanding who your user is by conducting user interviews and by literally talking to them.
That sounds great. And I think that's a really good way of describing the different ways and methods that you can go about it, and how, for example, when you conduct surveys, it can be fast, but it might not be the most accurate depiction, while interviews might be a bit more time consuming, but it gives you a more comprehensive aspect, as you said. And you also mentioned something that I really like, that you said that in product management, one of the really important aspects is having empathy. What do you think are some other traits that someone who's looking to go into product management needs to have?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess it's like, what makes you a good fit? What traits? Okay, you're nodding, so I'm going to take that as a yes. So I think empathy is certainly one. You need to be able to feel for the person who's using your product or your platform. I think if something goes wrong, you're like, I don't really care. You're probably not going to be great at this role. You're probably not going to thrive. I think another thing that is really important is organization and leadership. So if, for instance, when you were in high school, when you were in university, you were often that person in group projects who was like good at coordinating people or good at keeping people on track, keeping people, for lack of a better word, accountable to the things that they were doing. Product management might be a good fit for you. Project management might also be a good fit for you because a lot of that work is tactical. What are we doing this sprint? What are we doing today? What are we doing this month? What are we doing this quarter? Who is going to be doing it? What is the timeline you're working with? Do you have everything you need? Have you connected with these people? Do you have these risks accounted for? You really need to be organized in order to do that because it can be really overwhelming, the number of things that need to get done and all of the different places where that information lives. And you really need to be a leader. So I think when you work in a role like this, you become the centralized point person for getting things done as they relate to your platform. You really need to take charge if there's something that you want done. Like for instance, for online banking, it touches on a lot of different things. A lot of things can happen in the business that impact online banking. When you want to change something on online banking, it's going to impact a lot of other places, and you need to coordinate a lot of different teams to make that happen, which means you're going to have to really hone in on your leadership muscle, try to figure out, okay, how can I help you understand what I really want to get done so you can be empowered to do it? How do I motivate you and inspire you to want to do this work, even if it's not the most sexy or it's a little bit tedious? How do I lead in a place where you might not be a direct manager of another person? And I think that another important skill is, I want to say extroversion, but I think it's more the ability to describe things, the ability to articulate. I spend a lot of my time talking. Quite literally, I spend a lot of meetings where people will ask me questions about online banking, and they will be strategizing on things to do and how does online banking play into that, and what is my plan here, what is on my roadmap, what am I doing about these things, what am I not doing about these things. You have to be, in some level, good at describing what you're doing succinctly so that your audience will understand what you're saying, considering how everyone is really busy and they want to get things done and understand things really quickly. You have to be able to articulate points. You have to be able to do it on your feet, and you have to do it in a way that your audience is going to understand you. Now, I might be totally saying this ironically because potentially nobody here is understanding anything I've said this entire podcast. But if that's the case, do as I say, not as I do.
That sounds great. And I've always wondered, how important would you say is technical knowledge to a product manager?
Oh, so important. I wish I was more technical. I wish I had the expertise to be able to read the code that's being written. I've been trying to get more technical from a data and analysis standpoint, like using SQL, for instance, or using data analytics tools. But when it comes to actually writing code in Python and JavaScript, that's not something that I'm strong at. I will often rely on somebody like a tech lead who is more well-versed in those areas. I think, though, a really strong technical product manager will be really effective in their role. Not that not having technical skills will necessarily make you less effective, but it will certainly be easier for you since you'll know what they've actually built, and you won't have to rely on them to explain to you how something would work.
And on that point, do you think coming from a business background, did that give you a set of skill set that you think helps you a lot in your day-to-day?
I think so. I think one of the things that I really learned about when I was studying at Queen's Commerce was how do you navigate a business environment? So I learned a lot of the terminology and the buzzwords that are often thrown around. I learned a lot more about, we do a lot of presentations when I was at Queen's. That's something that I continue to do today. We do a lot of work in teams. You have to really learn how to work in a team environment and how to enjoy it. That's something that I do a lot in my day-to-day. I think that it was actually a really cool way to prepare myself. I didn't necessarily know that I wanted to get into the kind of work that I do now, but I think the skills that I learned while I was there in public speaking, in presenting, in teamwork, in leadership, in staying organized and on top of things, all of that translated really well into the work that I do now.
That sounds great. And I think from what you said, it seems like a lot of the soft skills that you learned at Queen's really helped you in your current role.
Oh, definitely. I think there were some technical skills that I was trying to pick up as well while I was at Queen's. I tried to learn a bit of computer science. I was learning a bit of accounting, but a lot of those things you can pick up and you can learn later on. It's really developing yourself fundamentally as a business professional with the soft skills that I talked about before, and really building out your mission statement of who you want to be and how you want to work. That I think is the biggest thing you can take away, or I took away from my business education.
Definitely. So looking back, maybe to not just the soft skills, but maybe more technical ones, what do you think is, for example, 3 that you think are the most critical?
Good question. So I think that data analysis is something that's really important. So if you know how to use SQL, you know how to use Looker, you know how to use QuickSight, these are things that will help you a lot later on, because it's a lot easier to do your job if you can pull your own data and you can refine your own data. I think that from a technical coding standpoint, it could be beneficial to pick up on some languages. So for instance, Python and JavaScript are the most popular right now. It would be really helpful for me if I knew how to code in Python or JavaScript. And I think the third one is Scrum principles. So this is something that I've wanted to learn more about for a while. There are a lot of courses that you can take to learn this. But for me, when I'm working with my teams and I'm trying to make sure everyone's being productive and everyone has the right things prioritized, I don't have a lot of technical training in that. I think that if I had more training as a Scrum Master, that would be really beneficial to me in my current role.
That sounds great. Could you explain to the audience who might not know what Scrum is?
I'm not 100% well versed in what a Scrum Master is because I've never actually worked with one. But depending on how your team and your company operates, I think a Scrum Master is somebody who's going to help you stay more productive and efficient. They have specific training in Scrum principles, either from Scrum Alliance or scrum.org. So they are really well versed to help keep your team on track and accountable for the things you need to do. Depending on how your team works, they also might be the one who runs your ceremonies. So your stand-ups or your huddles, your retros, your whiteboarding sessions, they might be run by your Scrum Master.
That sounds great. So I guess on the flip side, what would you say are some struggles that you've faced throughout your career?
Yeah, I think this is going to sound cheesy, but I think confidence was the biggest struggle that I faced in my career. It can be really intimidating, or at least it was for me, to step out of like a academic environment where things were a lot more certain and you were a lot more assured of like these are the next steps, these are the expectations, to be stepping into a world where you have a role that's very dynamic and very changeable, and it's really based on like what the business need is and what you need to get done to make your big objective happen. A lot of times that's going to mean you're going to talk to some pretty senior people. A lot of the times that's going to mean you are going to have to socialize your results and your approach to others and have it be put up for to be challenged. For me, I was always really scared, especially if I had to talk to somebody more senior or if I needed to be presenting my plan or my findings for something and to get feedback. I was really scared because I was worried that I would come off not prepared or unintelligent, or that my plan would just be torn apart. That was a really big challenge for me because it's really hard to do your job when you're scared of everybody you work with. What I've done since then is I've gotten to know a lot of the people I work with more on a friendly basis. It's a lot easier to work with someone if you don't see them as just another scary person sitting on the other side of the room. And really like embracing my own abilities. Like I was hired for a reason. I'm doing this for a reason. To be afraid of making a mistake, or to be afraid of the people I work with, or to be afraid of being challenged are not ways that I can learn and grow. Reining in those feelings of, oh my God, I'm so scared. I don't want to fail. I don't want to be criticized. I don't want to do the wrong thing. Letting go of that, because you'll never perfectly do anything. And really embrace the concept of going for it if you think it's a good choice, managing the risks that come up, and taking feedback constructively as a way to improve the things that you do or the things that I do, as a way to improve as a professional, as a way to make sure my work is the best version of what it could be. Really leaning into that, the sense that I can't control everything and it's not worthwhile to be worrying about everything. It's worthwhile to be managing risks effectively. It's worthwhile to be building good relationships, and it's worthwhile to be taking feedback and applying it in order to build the best version of work product possible. Embracing all of that and trying to get over my sense of lack of self-confidence that I feel sometimes, that has been one of the biggest hurdles that I felt in my career.
That was very insightful. Would you say that it kind of qualifies as imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I was talking to my manager about this once, and she was saying that actually sounds a lot like imposter syndrome. Then I've watched a TED talk about it, and I read a little bit about it. And I think that what I'm describing, I think it is a good fit for what imposter syndrome is often described as. It's odd because when you're experiencing it, it doesn't feel like that. I guess imposter syndrome is where you feel like you're a fraud for the things that you do, because you fear that you just got into it accidentally or something, or you don't deserve to be there, unlike everybody else. I guess for me, when I was in the throes of the chaos, I wasn't thinking about it that way, because I was more thinking, I'm just doing a horrible job and everybody knows it and nobody is telling me because they're all just too nice. What I could have been thinking about instead was, I was hired for a reason. I went through a very rigorous screening and recruitment process. Multiple people along the way felt that I was a good fit for the things that I'm doing now, and really embracing that. Imposter syndrome is fascinating because I think for me, when I was living in it, I didn't really notice. But in hindsight, looking back on it, I think all the boxes were checked off for the sense of I don't belong here, the sense of I'm fearful, and the sense of that really not being the case. I mean, I was promoted a few months ago. Clearly, people don't think I'm terrible at my job, but it always felt like I was.
Congrats on your promotion, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
What was your previous role, out of curiosity?
It's basically the same role. I do essentially the same things. I was just moved from an associate level to a senior associate level.
Oh, okay. So just to go back on the imposter syndrome. So yeah, I think you described it very well. And I think your approach was also very insightful in the sense that to go from it, to look at it from a growing perspective and to take feedback constructively to become better and better at what you do. I think that's a great way of approaching it.
I think so too. It can be so easy to be discouraged, especially when you're really proud of something that you made and you feel like it was the right decision to be making. You have a great plan in place. And when I used to get some feedback of like, hey, maybe you should actually pivot to this. Have you considered these angles? I would get kind of confused. I was like, I think you're missing the big picture of like what we're trying to accomplish here. But in reality, I think a lot of that feedback is always very valid. Like it's always really useful to have other viewpoints because they bring up edge cases that I didn't think about. They bring up solutions to problems that I had put in the parking lot. They, through their feedback, every single time, my plan, my solution, my decision with more well-managed risk and with a decision that is more well-aligned with the business. It can be really easy to see like people who are trying to help you as like enemies, but really they're trying to make you better through helping you make better decisions and helping you learn and grow.
That sounds great. And that kind of reminds me of how there's different type of users and that how they might want different features or have different viewpoints on what they want the product to head into. So the different types of feedback kind of remind me of that reality.
Yeah, I didn't think about it like that, but that is a really good point. I think if you also tie it back into like when you were in school, for instance, your feedback will often come from your professors or your teachers, or maybe other people if they're looking over your work. And it can be really easy to get lost in this is ridiculous. I definitely addressed those points. You didn't give me due credit for these things that I did. It can be really easy to get caught in that rabbit hole. I certainly have found myself there a number of times. But the way I wish I'd approached it more was, okay, this person didn't feel like I had exhibited these things, but I did exhibit those things. Where is the disconnect coming from? How can I bridge that gap so that in the future, when I'm doing projects or submissions, I'm able to get the result that I'm looking for? Or, okay, they felt like I was missing in this category. That's fair feedback. Maybe I was missing in that category, or I didn't adequately express a plan for it, or I didn't adequately address it in my write-up. That's something to keep in mind for next time. I will be addressing these points in the future.
That sounds great. I've also often heard that product managers are called the CEO of their products. Is that true? And what does that exactly mean?
That's a really good question. So I think it's intended to be more about like when you're a product manager or a process manager or something where you sit at the intersection of a lot of things like business and tech and design. You are in charge of your world. Like you own this product, this platform, this thing that you manage. And technically, I think it's meant to mean you are in charge of everything that has to do with that product. This whole kingdom is yours to lead. I think in practice, though, that statement can come off kind of misleading because you're not always in charge of things like pricing strategy, things like marketing, things like who are your users, what is the brand you're going for. You're usually a central stakeholder to those decisions and those conversations, but you're not actually always in charge. Some product managers, I think, are. Some of them are literally like they will work on creating the marketing copy. They will be working on determining pricing strategy. They are working on who is the vendor that we're working with, negotiating what the terms are. But I think of it more so as like the role is to be providing guiding principles of what you want to be doing. If you have a team of others who are going to be helping you with that work, your role is to be providing guiding principles or the intent of the road you're supposed to be going on or they're supposed to be going on so that they can then take that and make decisions on their side to execute on the North Star or the vision that you have built out. I think to me, that's not so much being a CEO as that is being like a champion of your product. You are championing what you want your product to be doing, and you are providing principles or guiding principles to help all of the other internal stakeholders within your business execute on the vision that you have described. Maybe you call that a CEO. I see that more as being like a champion of your product or your platform or whatever you own.
That sounds great. So would you say a more accurate depiction would be like you are the first one who's paving the road for the people who are responsible of more precise aspects, as you said, like marketing, et cetera, to kind of go along that big road, but then afterwards kind of go in their own directions, but still following like the main road or like the guiding principle?
Yeah, I think you draw the North Star so that everyone will end up in the same place. Now, that being said, there are product managers, especially at startups, for instance, who are literally going to be the ones who are doing the marketing copy, who are like literally negotiating certain terms. I think that's like totally valid. And in that case, maybe you are a lot more like a CEO because you're down and dirty, you are making these decisions. But I think in a lot of cases, you're going to be working with other stakeholders. So in order to not be bogged down by like 1,000 decisions that you're going to have to make here, the focus can be about, as I said before, defining the North Star so everybody ends up in the same place at the end, which is the place that you wanted to take it.
That sounds great. So what would you say is your favorite feature that you've rolled out so far?
Ooh, I can't comment on the features that I've rolled out because all of that is in pre-production. But maybe I can tell you about some of the things that I've built in hackathons. My favorite thing that we built in a hackathon was a map that we built for an Ontario organization that works to empower Indigenous communities who are rights holders in certain areas of Ontario, so land or water. We built an interactive map so that an individual Indigenous community can go in and indicate on a grid which are the boxes that they have rights in. And that way, a developer or a urban planner or something, or whoever is using this map can go in and they can click on the specific area they care about and they can see all the Indigenous communities that they're going to have to talk to. It's an easy solution to centralize information that exists in a lot of different complicated places. And it was not too difficult to build. It was something that provided a ton of impact for relatively lowish effort or a proportional level of effort that was arguably like easier. I love this product because I think that a great product is one that is honestly designed, is one that takes into account a valid and pressing user need, and is one that is innovative in its own way. So I think this product checks off all of those boxes. You know, it's honestly designed in that it does what it looks like it's going to do. Everything is very clearly labeled. You could figure out what you needed, technically, even if you didn't have a user manual, although we made them anyway. It is something that fulfills a pressing user need. The organization that we worked with had been wanting to do this for a really long time, and they had received a lot of feedback about wanting an easy solution to be fulfilling on like informational asymmetry on both sides. This was a product, or I guess you call it a feature, that addressed that need and hit the nail on the head. And I thought it was very innovative. There are a lot of maps, I've been told, on the Ontario Indigenous community. A lot of them are color-coded. So in areas like Toronto, for instance, you're going to see a lot of intersecting colors that make it really hard to view anything. This map doesn't have that problem because in order to protect the identity and the specific borders of certain groups, we don't show the actual map and all the grid lines. I thought it was very innovative because it's something that doesn't exist and it's something that uniquely addresses this need.
That sounds great. I totally agree on how there is this need, and I feel like your product really addressed the need of kind of linking the Indigenous communities with like the developers and the land rights. You mentioned at the end the maps and the intersection of colors. I'm not sure I totally understood that. Could you explain a bit more how your map was different from those ones, as like you mentioned that it protected the identities of the people filling in the boxes, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, essentially what that map is a big grid where an Indigenous community can click on all the boxes in the grid, or they can draw a big shape and capture all of the boxes where they are rights holders, or they have some right over that land, over that water, and need to be consulted if there are any changes being made. Other maps that we've seen had a design choice where every shape was colored in and some of them overlapped. So you would see this very confusing customer experience of like a ton of colors. And since they were overlapping, it was really hard to tell which ones were overlapping. It basically just looked like a mishmash of color. And it was really hard for you if you were trying to tell who are all the communities I need to talk to who have rights on this piece of land or this square. Since they were all overlapping colors, it would be really hard to visually differentiate who was which and where these places ended and where they began. This was something that we discovered when we were working through the different iterations, and we'd shown it to our partner, and they said, hey, I think it would be really confusing if you did it that way, if you have all of these overlapping sectors and shapes, because that already exists, and that's really, really confusing because you can never tell what this area is and how many colors are on it. So instead, we made the decision to make it a map where you can't see any of the borders. This protects the indigenous communities and where their actual borders are as drawn by themselves. And this also makes it a lot less visually confusing, because what you would basically do if you were a developer is you would click on a box, and on the side, you would have every indigenous community who has self-reported a right, that they are a rights holder for that box listed on the side. You don't have to visually try to differentiate how many colors are stacked on the same grid or the same box. You won't get as confused since you don't have as many squiggles going around. You're just seeing the grid and you can just differentiate okay, this is the specific box in the grid that I'm looking for. It was a much more seamless experience, and it had the double purpose of also protecting some of the anonymity of the indigenous communities who were self-reporting.
That makes a lot of sense the way you explained it. So instead of the overlapping and the developer having to filter it themselves, it kind of enhances it by just streamlining the different communities. And then once the developer clicks, and then it shows the different right holders.
Exactly. And I think this was a really good example of a time when consulting users was really important, because we didn't know that was something that already existed and that was a confusing experience. We didn't know that some of the indigenous communities had very narrow holdings sometimes that could overlap in places that were high density like Toronto. That was something we had no idea of. But when we were able to show an early iteration of it, we were able to get that feedback in time to make the change so that the end product did not have that frustrating user experience.
That sounds great. So when it comes to your day-to-day, what do you think is your favorite part of the workday?
My favorite part of the workday, I think I call it having those aha moments. I think you spend a lot of time, you might be negotiating for resourcing for doing something. You might be trying to figure out a really tough problem of okay, this is a really bad experience that we're potentially going to have. How do we prevent it? Or how do we proactively address it? There are a lot of problems that will come at you in a day that you are now trying to tackle. What I love is that aha moment when you have consulted the right stakeholders, you have gathered the information that you need. Sometimes it's incomplete information. Usually it is imperfect information. You have considered the solutions, and you've found, ideally, a solution that best addresses the potential risks and downfalls and also maximizes on some of the positive returns of what you can do. When you figure out how to solve a problem in an innovative, in a helpful, in a cost-effective or effort proportional way, and it's a solution that makes a lot of sense, that's grounded in data, that is something that all of the stakeholders are comfortable with, I love that feeling, because it means you're one step closer to building out what your North Star is going to. And something that has been out of place is now going to be put back into place.
That definitely sounds like a great feeling. So it's like the light bulb moment, the moment where you kind of put the pieces of the puzzles together and you kind of see where you should be headed.
Exactly. It's like your eureka moment, except instead of running out of a bathtub, I'm staring at my screen and being like, oh my God, I figured it out. Okay, this is what we're going to do. And we're just celebrating on Zoom.
Yeah, I feel like as a student, especially working on different projects, sometimes you kind of spend a lot of time trying to figure out how are we going to approach this. And then there's that moment where you all kind of think, oh, wait, what if we do this? And then it kind of just clicks.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when I was in school, we always had so many fires going on everywhere that it was hard to celebrate a win. Like when we had finally figured out how to solve something, or we'd finally been able to finish something. We didn't really have time to celebrate it because usually by the time we finished it, it was like 20 minutes before it was due. And we were rushing it into the Dropbox or into whatever submission tool we were supposed to be using. We never really had a chance to really sit and like, hey, that was awesome. We did great. We came up with a solution that made sense. We had a big win. I never really got to celebrate that when I was in uni because it was always like, okay, that's one down, on to the next 57 problems on my list. I don't know if that's something that you felt as well.
Yeah, definitely. Also kind of reminds me of final exam seasons. It's like you rush for one exam and then the exam finishes and you're like, okay, it's done. On to the next one. And then usually only after the last one, you kind of take a breath and then you're like, okay, we're done. We can relax and celebrate a bit now.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that. There were days when I would have exams basically back to back, and I would have so much adrenaline and sometimes caffeine running through my system that when I was finally finished, my hands would be shaking because of the stress of the day and all the things that I was trying to like bare knuckle through. I never got a chance to celebrate like, oh, this is the final exam of this course. This is the last thing I'll do for this course with this professor, with this list of giant notebooks of notes that I have. I think if I were to relive that experience, that's something that I would remind myself more of, to celebrate my wins and to really embrace that I'm doing a good job on certain things. I think that I was more interested in, I'm done worrying about this piece. I have all of these other pieces to worry about. How do I accurately distribute my anxiety so that the right things are getting the right amount of worrying? When really, I could have been thinking about, I did a really great job on this. What are some things that I can learn from that? And let me just sit in this nice feeling just for a little bit, for a moment when I've righted something in my world and I don't have to worry about the other anxiety inducing projects for like 10 more minutes. I wish I'd done that more when I was in school.
I definitely relate with that. And I think it's so important, as you said, to celebrate the wins and to kind of just be there and celebrate it and then experience like the feeling and then regroup afterwards and then keep moving along. But just to stop for a moment and be like, oh, I just did that, you know?
Yeah, stop and smell the metaphorical roses.
So to circle back a bit onto the project management industry, what do you notice are some trends that are gaining traction in the industry as a general?
Do you mean project management or something more like in the product tech space?
So in the product tech space or methodologies or things that you see are changing, some trends that are gaining traction.
Sure. So I will caveat. I started in 2019, in late 2019, which means a lot of the time that I've actually worked has been in a COVID world. So take what I have to say with a grain of salt. But the first thing I want to note about trends is how COVID has impacted how we work now and how we will be working in the future. I think in a pre-COVID world, we would be doing things like whiteboarding a lot more. Like you would get up and you physically draw out what you want something to look like or how something technically works or to explain your thinking. Now, I think people are trying to embrace digital tools like InVision app or Google Jamboards or something in order to fulfill a similar purpose. COVID has certainly changed the way that we operate, both in things like how we whiteboard to how we communicate with each other. In another world, I might be sitting down with somebody and like drawing with them and showing them, okay, this is what we want it to look like, pointing out the places where we want to be changing it, and like having that more of that face-to-face sitting next to somebody interaction. COVID has certainly changed that. It's meant that we have to figure out different ways to work. It's meant that we have to figure out how to be effective even when we can't hand things over physically to anybody or draw things with anybody, or we're talking to people through a little box. And I think that some of these trends or some of these practices are here to stay. I think that a lot of people, now that they've experienced working from home and they've experienced how productive they can be working from home, this is something that is going to be desirable in a future workplace. So we were always going to have to figure out how to digitalize the way that we work. I think that's a trend that's going to be carrying on long into the future. I think another one is the regulation of tech. So I think people have been talking about this for a while, how tech is a largely unregulated industry. It's very new. It doesn't have a ton of oversight yet. But I think what we've seen in the last few years is public sentiment about that is shifting. So we've seen, for instance, social media and media companies like Twitter and YouTube, the criticism they've gotten or the leadership that they've had to take over things like hate speech and censorship that take place on their platforms. Often a response is, hey, we're not regulated. We work on the free market. How people behave is up to them. But maybe that's something that should be changing. And powerful platforms like these should be held accountable for how what kind of speech they allow to take place on their platform. We've seen things like recently in Australia, Facebook and Google were battling with Australia over whether they should pay for news that's displayed in Google search results, that's displayed on Facebook news feeds. And I think in this case, Australia actually drew a hard line here and said, yes, we are implementing this legislation. And both companies had some interesting reactions to it. These situations, I think, illustrate how public perception, public opinion has been shifting more towards wanting tech companies to be held accountable for what they do on their platforms, for wanting regulation that will protect end users like us, and for wanting tech platforms to pay into the social services that they take advantage of. I'm thinking of things like Uber, things like Lyft, things like food delivery apps. There have been a lot of conversations about whether or not those workers are allowed to unionize, whether they're classified as gig workers, whether they're classified as employees. That a lot of tech companies are in this interesting phase. I want to call it almost like a growing phase, where they are growing a lot and really quickly and impacting a lot of people. But the world hasn't yet caught up on how it wants to apply reasonable restrictions on how they operate in order to protect all of us.
That was some great insight. And I really resonated with the COVID trends. And I think I've discovered some things through working from home that I wouldn't have discovered otherwise. Like, for example, we've never really thought of having online classes and all of that. And as much as I miss the social interaction, there are some good things that come out of staying at home and the comfort of the house. I was wondering, did you have any new work habits that spawned from this work from home trend that you really enjoyed?
I think this one is a little off center, but what I've actually learned a lot about is the importance of an ergonomic setup. So a few months into the pandemic, I've always in my life worked purely off of a laptop. I used to travel a lot. I would just go to class and I'd like to just like shove my laptop in my bag and show up. But over time, that has actually been really bad for my neck alignment, for my spinal alignment. I didn't really notice that because I was just thinking, I'm 23. There's no way I have any back problems, period. One thing that I think the pandemic has really exposed is the deficiencies of my personal work setup. So now I think I have a much better setup. I've got an ergonomic chair, I've got a monitor, I've got a laptop stand in order to make sure everything's more eye level so I'm not crouched down. Something that I've certainly learned and that I've certainly changed in my working habits is prioritizing physically how I'm working and making sure that the way that I'm doing it is very, like my setup is ergonomic and is taking care of like the physical me. It's not really something that I thought about when I was in school. It's not something I really thought about when I had originally started working, but it was something I had to think about as I was more like, it was literally just me and I can shift anything in my working environment, but I wasn't focused as much on how do I make it more ergonomic? How do I make sure I can be well in the way that I work. That is maybe an off-center answer to your question, but for me, one of the ways that I think working from home has fundamentally shifted for me, has shifted my working habits, is I paid a lot more attention to like my ergonomic setup. And I have, on a side note, a lot more respect for chiropractors and the work that they do.
I think that's a great answer and not off center at all. And I've also noticed that the ergonomics have become a trendy topic since COVID. And myself, with my setup, I've tried to upgrade it to make it more comfortable since I'm sitting here pretty much all day. And I've also noticed that a lot of people have thought that too, because all the standing desks, the various desks are all sold out on like pretty much every website or back ordered.
I guess that's good for IKEA and Staples. Well done to them. The brick and mortar business may be up for some challenges, but anybody selling office equipment is probably doing pretty well.
Yeah, definitely. So as we prepare to wrap up this episode, I was wondering if you had any advice for students who are looking to go into product management.
That's such a good question. So I think that in the academic environment right now, there's not a lot of information about product management, about tech, about careers in any digital environment, digital industry. And I think that perhaps is a trend that's changing. Queen's, for instance, has just posted an associate professor role, I think in digital transformation. Potentially, they're going to be looking at increasing courses that are about product management, and career centers will be pivoting the way that they prepare students to talk more about these kind of careers. For those who want to be pursuing this kind of path, I think that I think for anybody who's looking to pursue any kind of path, I think that there's a level of introspection to be taken before you make any steps. And I say this because I remember what it was like to be in uni and thinking, I need to find a job. I need to find a job or I'm going to be unemployed and everything will suck. I felt this desperation to just find anything. And it was really only when I stopped to really think about what I wanted to be doing, thinking big picture about who I was, what I'm good at, what I enjoy, where I want to be. Being able to be honest with myself about where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do was one of the most important things that I could have done as part of my journey. So for instance, if you really want to go into a product management role and you're looking at roles that are in product management, they're not always called product managers. They're all sometimes called like product owners. My role is technically called process manager. Some of them are called product analysts. There are a lot of different ways to spell it out. But if that's something that you're looking at, some questions I would encourage you to ask yourself are, when you're in a team, who are you usually? Are you often kind of like the team leader? Are you often the kind of person that is taking notes to transcribe and codify the decisions of your team? Are you the person who's really pressing the team for, hey, like, I don't know if we're going to the right direction strategically for what we want to be doing. I think we need to consider some of these risks here. Are you a person who is very analytical? Are you a person who likes to create? Like when you're in a team, for instance, do you often take on some work that's about building and creating something? Or are you more about running the engine? Thinking about who you are on a team, like in a academic environment, not a perfect indicator and not the end all be all, but it could be a good exercise for the roles that you naturally inhabit. That might be a good fit for you later on. If, for instance, you tend to be that team leader, you tend to be that go-getter who's like, okay, guys, let's get coordinated and let's get this done. I can help us like stay on track of things, stay productive and like help drive these conversations. You might be a good fit. If you're somebody that likes creating things and building things, specifically maybe things that are in tech, this might be a really good role for you. If you're someone who has a background that might be amenable to something in product management. So for instance, if you maybe have a business background, but you've always been interested in looking at the intersection between business and tech and users and design, maybe this is a good role for you. There are a lot of questions I could throw at you for trying to figure out who you are and where you want to go. But the work there is ultimately up to the individuals themselves. So I think I get this question a couple times. I work with a few mentees and a few buddies. There's like this fear that if I don't figure out everything that I am and everything I want to do in my 10 to 15-year plan right now, I'm going to flounder and I'm not going to get anywhere that I want to be, and everything will suck. And there's also this sense of like, I want this. This is the thing. I want to be X. I want to be a consultant at Bain. I want to be a product manager at Google. I want to be whatever it is. In both cases, there's this sense of you want to artificially build momentum just so you can feel like you're moving and not feel like you're transgressing. I think a lot of that has to do with like fear that I can certainly empathize with and that I've certainly experienced myself. My biggest piece of advice, though, is to really stop and be honest and think. I really doubt that the very first job that you get is going to set the full trajectory of the rest of your career. I just don't. I think that you can take things one step at a time and take roles that you think are interesting and continue to make decisions and build your career as you go along and as you pivot. You can be more agile with the way that you move out your career. And B, I think that to chase something or to pursue it because it's shiny and glossy and fabulous might not lend you the kind of career satisfaction and happiness that you think it will. It's through analyzing who you really are, what you are passionate about, not what you say you're passionate about on your resume or what you say you're passionate about in an interview, but what you're actually really passionate about, who you are, how you work in teams, what are the things that motivate you, what are the things you love, what are the things you hate, who are the people you want to spend a ton of time with, where do you want to do that? When there are problems that happen, what kind of role do you want to be in such that it will be worthwhile to be cleaning up these problems? The biggest advice that I have for anybody, for this role and any role, is to have that moment of honesty with yourself. And I think that through having that honest conversation with yourself and really stopping to think, to celebrate who you are, and to realign yourself for where you want to be next, that will be one of the most important and powerful things that you can do to make sure you have a career that you're really proud of and you set yourself up for genuine, satisfying success.
That was a great and very insightful answer. I think that's a great way to end off this episode. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me, Amy. It was a pleasure.
And for me as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for tuning in and having us be a part of your journey to code your future.
Make sure to follow us on social media to stay in the loop and for a chance to have your questions answered in our next episode. See you then.